A 6-year-old German shepherd stopped eating and blocked a former Navy SEAL from closing the back door. The dog led him into the wet woods, repeatedly stopping to make sure he still followed. Beneath an abandoned utility truck, they found a cream-colored puppy wearing a yellow tag marked G7. Water, food, and a dry towel showed someone had left her there expecting to return. But G7 belonged to a gauge station that had been shut down for 8 years. The only man who recently requested access was missing. So why had he left his puppy behind? Stay with this story to the end, and like and subscribe for more journeys of loyalty and healing. By the last week of August, the heat in Stonebridge Hollow had begun to feel worn out. The western fields had faded from green to dry gold. The road still held warmth after sunset, and thunderheads gathered over the northern hills almost every afternoon. Nolan Pierce, 39, lived beyond the last tight cluster of houses where the county road narrowed beside the woods. 3 years after leaving the Navy SEALs, he made his living repairing generators, boat engines, pumps, and outdoor equipment in the workshop behind his small house. His days were orderly because Nolan preferred them that way. Customers dropped things off. Nolan fixed them. Bills got paid. Dinner happened around the same time. Invitations into other people's lives were easier to decline than accept. The one creature allowed to interfere with that routine was Rook, Nolan's 6-year-old black and tan German shepherd, a steady search and rescue dog with amber eyes, a small notch along the edge of his right ear, and the unnerving habit of noticing things before Nolan did. That evening, a brief storm had rolled through just before dark. Nolan was standing at the kitchen counter, still wearing his olive t-shirt and dark cargo pants from the workshop, when Rook stopped halfway through dinner. The dog lifted his head from the bowl, his ears turned toward the back door. He listened. Then he walked over, scratched the floor 3 times with one front paw, and looked at Nolan. "You already went out." Rook did not move. Nolan dried his hands and opened the door. Warm, damp air entered the kitchen. Water ticked from the porch roof. Beyond the yard, the forest was dark and still except for insects starting up again after the rain. Nolan stepped outside and scanned the tree line. Nothing. No animal in the yard. No headlights on the service road. No neighbor calling from the woods. He waited another 20 seconds, then turned back. "Very informative." He started closing the door. Rook came up the step and put one front paw across the threshold. Nolan stopped before the door touched him. "Seriously?" The shepherd looked past Nolan toward the flashlight shelf in the mudroom, then back toward the trees. Nolan knew that look. Rook did not waste energy. He did not invent emergencies because dinner had become boring. When the dog decided something mattered, ignoring him usually meant coming back later and admitting he had been right. All right. Nolan checked the analog watch on his wrist, pulled on his faded charcoal field jacket, took a flashlight, and followed Rook into the woods. Rook moved fast enough to show purpose, but not so fast that Nolan lost him. At the first bend in the trail, the shepherd stopped and looked back. When Nolan reached him, Rook moved on. He did it again near a fallen cedar, then once more where the familiar walking trail split from an old county maintenance path. Check back. It was one of Rook's oldest working habits. "Go ahead. Confirm the other half of the team is still there. Continue." Nolan had always considered it good training and nothing more. Tonight, with rainwater brushing from leaves onto his jacket, it irritated something deeper in him because Rook was asking for trust without explaining where they were going. Nolan preferred information before commitment. He preferred checking a problem himself, rather than being told someone else had already checked it. That tendency had followed him home from the service and hardened there, though Nolan rarely put a name to why. He simply knew that the last time he had seen something that did not feel right and allowed another man's certainty to end the discussion, the consequences had lasted far longer than the conversation. That was enough memory for one dark trail. Rook turned off the path, climbed a low embankment, and disappeared briefly through tall grass. Nolan followed. The old county maintenance spur had barely changed in years. A corrugated metal shelter leaned beside the road, and beneath it sat a faded utility truck that had not moved in a long time. One tire was flat. Weeds had grown around the rear axle. Rook slowed before reaching it. His head lowered. His body became quiet in the particular way Nolan recognized from search work. Not alarmed, not aggressive, simply focused. Then Nolan heard it. A tiny whine came from beneath the truck. Rook stopped. Nolan lowered the flashlight. "What did you find?" Something pale shifted in the darkness. He crouched and angled the beam away from the opening so it would not shine directly into the animal's eyes. A German Shepherd puppy was pressed against the dry ground beneath the passenger side. She could not have been much more than 7 weeks old. Her coat was a light cream sable, darker along the back and muzzle. One ear had started to stand, while the other still folded softly to the side. Her paws seemed slightly too large for the rest of her body. Dirt marked her belly, but Nolan saw no obvious injury. She looked tired, thirsty, and uncertain about the two strangers now occupying the edge of her hiding place. "Well," Nolan said quietly. "There you are." He shifted forward. Rook stepped across his knees. Nolan looked at him. "I know how to approach a dog." Rook remained in place. There was no growl, no tension in his mouth. He simply blocked the most direct route. Nolan almost argued with him, which would have been ridiculous even by his standards. Instead, he waited. Rook lay down several feet from the truck and turned his head slightly away from the puppy. He did not stare at her. He did not crawl closer. He made himself available and then stopped asking for anything. Nolan understood. "Fine. Your way." For nearly a minute, nothing happened. Then the puppy stretched her nose beyond the edge of the truck. She sniffed once and withdrew. A few seconds later, she tried again. Rook stayed still. Nolan kept one hand resting on his knee. The puppy finally brought one paw onto the open ground, then another. Her body remained low as she crossed the last foot to Rook and pressed her nose against his front leg. Rook lowered his head and sniffed gently along her ear. That was all. No excitement. No attempt to crowd her. The puppy leaned against him, as if the older dog had become the safest thing she could find. Only then did Nolan extend his hand low. She looked at Rook first, then stretched forward and sniffed Nolan's knuckles. Nolan scratched lightly beneath her chin. "Good choice," he murmured. "He's more patient than I am." As the puppy shifted, something yellow moved beside her collar. Nolan looked closer. A narrow strip of survey flagging had been tied through the soft collar with a careful knot. Black marker stood out against the yellow plastic. G7. Nolan touched the tag, but left it in place. He swept the flashlight around the underside of the truck and immediately saw that the puppy had not simply wandered there. A collapsible water bowl sat beside the rear tire with a small amount of rain-dirtied water remaining. Several pieces of puppy food rested on a folded paper plate. A small towel had been placed beneath the deepest part of the shelter, its center still dry. Everything was simple, but everything was deliberate. Someone had put her here, not thrown her away. Put her here. There was a difference. Nolan stood and looked toward the unused service road disappearing through the trees. Whoever left you expected to come back. The words came out before he thought about them. The puppy had already lowered herself against Rook's shoulder. Rook rose and moved toward the road. He sniffed the edge where gravel met wet grass, followed it for several yards, then stopped. The storm had washed over the spur hard enough to turn shallow ruts into muddy channels. Nolan watched Rook work briefly, then return without committing to a direction. That mattered too. Rook was not pretending to have something simply because Nolan wanted an answer. Nolan knew people less disciplined than that. He examined the old shelter again. No backpack, no crate, no vehicle recently parked beneath the roof. A few disturbed patches in the wet gravel could have meant almost anything after the rain. Nolan photographed the bowl, towel, food, and G7 marker without moving them. He could call the sheriff now, but there was little useful information he could give beyond the fact that he had found a healthy puppy beneath an abandoned truck. The nearest animal control officer would take time to reach them, and the puppy was already beginning to shiver in the cooler air after the storm. Nolan looked at Rook. "You brought me this problem." Rook looked back. "Helpful." The puppy tried to stand, walked 2 steps, and sat down again as if reconsidering the entire concept of travel. That settled the immediate question. Nolan carried her home. She resisted for the first part of the walk, craning her neck over Nolan's forearm to look behind them. Rook stayed close. Each time the puppy shifted restlessly, the older dog moved into view beside Nolan's leg. After several minutes, she stopped fighting the ride and rested her chin against Nolan's wrist. Back at the house, Nolan turned an old laundry basket into a temporary bed and found a shallow dish for water. The puppy drank, stepped directly into the bowl, startled herself, backed into a kitchen cabinet, then stared at the water as though it had personally betrayed her. Nolan looked at Rook. Highly trained. Rook sat down. "I'm aware you found her. That doesn't make you management." The puppy sneezed, found the edge of a shop rag hanging from a chair, and tried to drag it away. Nolan caught it before she put the oily fabric in her mouth. She looked up at him with wide brown eyes, one ear standing and the other collapsing sideways. He considered names he had heard people give German shepherds over the years. Most sounded too serious for an animal currently losing an argument with her own feet. "Piper." The puppy chewed briefly at the empty air. "Close enough." Nolan photographed the yellow flag more clearly and loosened the knot just enough to make sure it was not rubbing against her collar. He planned to call the county and animal services first thing in the morning. For tonight, there was nothing else sensible to do. That should have allowed him to stop thinking about it. It did not. Piper was too young to hide what interested her. A car passing the house barely earned a glance. When an older diesel pickup rumbled along the county road sometime after 10, she pushed upright in the basket and looked toward the front window until the sound faded. Later, Nolan dropped a metal measuring spoon while cleaning the kitchen. It bounced against the sink 3 times in quick succession. Piper's head snapped around. For several seconds, she searched toward the door. Then she became distracted by the corner of her towel and forgot the matter completely. Nolan did not turn the reaction into more than it was. 7-week-old puppies reacted to sounds. Still, he remembered it. Rook normally slept outside Nolan's bedroom door. That night, he did not. He settled a few feet from Piper's basket and rested his head across his paws. Piper woke several times. Each time she saw Rook nearby, she settled faster. At a little after 2 in the morning, Nolan heard a soft whine and came into the living room. Piper stood with her front paws against the basket, looking toward the back door. Rook was already sitting beside her. Nolan opened the door and checked the yard. Nothing. Piper kept looking past him for several seconds before curling down again. That was the first moment Nolan felt something other than curiosity. Someone had cared enough to leave water. Someone had chosen a dry place. Someone had tied a marker carefully to a growing puppy's collar. Whoever it was had probably believed the separation would be short. Nolan knew something about plans built around the assumption that there would be time later. He did not let the thought develop far enough to become a memory. Instead, he returned to the kitchen table and placed the yellow strip beneath the lamp. G7. The format had bothered him all evening. He went to the small desk by the window and opened the drawer where he kept old repair invoices. 2 months earlier, the County Water Resources Office had brought him a portable generator that kept losing output under load. Nolan found the work order. Equipment location, G3 auxiliary power. Another invoice from the previous year, G5 field unit. Gauge stations. Nolan sat back. The simplest thing would have been to open maps, search service roads, or drive out and start checking county sites at first light. The impulse came naturally. Find the problem. Verify it personally. Do not wait for someone else to tell him what he had already seen. He looked across the room. Rook was awake, watching him. Piper slept behind the basket wall. Nolan closed the invoice folder. If G7 belonged to the county, someone at the county could tell him what G7 meant. Calling them was not surrendering responsibility. It was using the person who actually had the information. That distinction should not have required effort. For Nolan, it did. He turned off the lamp. At 8:14 the next morning, Nolan called the Stonebridge County Water Resources Office from his workshop. Piper was inside a temporary pen he had assembled from spare panels, attempting to lift a rubber ball almost as large as her head. Rook lay outside the pen with the resigned expression of a veteran assigned to supervise a recruit who had no idea what the rules were. A woman named Lila answered. Nolan introduced himself and read the marker. G7? Right. What equipment are you calling about? A German Shepherd. There was a pause. A what? Puppy. Approximately 7 weeks. You found a dog at gauge 7? No. I found G7 tied to the dog. Typing followed. Where? An old county maintenance spur north of my property. More typing. Then silence. Nolan straightened slightly. What? That number shouldn't be in current field use. Why not? Gauge 7 was shut down 8 years ago. Nolan looked through the workshop door toward Piper. Removed? Deactivated. I'm checking archived access now. The keyboard started again. Rook raised his head, watching Nolan instead of Piper. Lila came back a moment later. That's strange. Nolan waited. There was an access request for G7 this month. County employee? No, outside archive access. Name? Franklin Voss. Nolan had never heard of him. Who is Franklin Voss? Another pause. When Lila spoke again, the casual office tone had left her voice. Mr. Pierce, I think you need to contact the sheriff. Why? Franklin Voss has been reported missing. Nolan's eyes went back to the yellow marker on his workbench. a closed gauge station, a 7-week-old puppy, a missing man. He called the Stonebridge Hollow Sheriff's Office before doing anything else. Sheriff Dana Whitlock, 56, returned his call within 15 minutes. Nolan knew Dana by sight. Compact, square-shouldered, usually in the dark, forest green uniform of the county sheriff's department, with brown hair beginning to silver around the temples. They had spoken only a handful of times. She had the kind of calm voice that made unnecessary drama sound embarrassing before anyone finished creating it. Nolan told her about Rook's behavior, the maintenance spur, the puppy, the water, food, towel, and G7 tag. Dana listened without interrupting. Then Nolan gave the location. There was a pause. Which shelter? The old one off Mercer Service Road. Near the abandoned utility truck? Yes. Dana went quiet again. Nolan looked at Rook. What aren't you saying? Franklin Voss's pickup was seen there Friday morning. Nolan's attention sharpened. Who saw it? A county mowing crew. They remembered because the spur is hardly used. Is his truck still missing? No. Nolan waited. Dana continued. It was found later on another service road several miles from there. Nolan looked toward Piper. The puppy had abandoned the rubber ball and pressed herself against the side of the pen closest to Rook. Rook stood, moved around the panels, and lay down beside her. Nolan saw the maintenance shelter again in his mind. The towel, the food, the water, the careful knot. But this time he stopped himself before turning those details into a complete answer. Dana had facts he did not. He had observations she had not seen. For once, that did not mean one of them needed to outrun the other. I think you should see the place, Nolan said. I do too. Don't move anything when you go back. The old reflex arrived immediately. Nolan almost told her he knew how to preserve a scene. Instead, he glanced at Rook. The shepherd was watching him again. Waiting. Understood. Nolan reached for his charcoal jacket. Rook rose. Piper climbed against the side of the pen as both of them moved toward the door. Nolan paused long enough to look back at her. The day before, his only responsibility had been a generator waiting on his workbench and a dog that already knew the rules of his house. Now a second German shepherd was sleeping under his roof, carrying the number of a place that should no longer matter. While somewhere beyond Stonebridge Hollow, a 74-year-old man had failed to return from whatever he had gone out to do. Nolan still did not know who Franklin Voss was. He did not know whether Franklin had tied G7 to Piper's collar. He did not know why Franklin's truck had left the place where the puppy remained. But he knew one thing had changed. He was going back to that shelter with Dana Whitlock. Not because Nolan had solved anything, because he finally had enough unanswered questions to know he should not try to solve them alone. Outside, Rook headed toward the truck, then stopped halfway across the yard. He looked back, checked. Nolan followed. Sheriff Dana Whitlock reached the old maintenance shelter 23 minutes after Nolan's call. Nolan was already there with Rook, but this time he had left Piper at the house inside the temporary pen with water and a blanket. He had also left the towel, bowl, food, and yellow G7 marker exactly where Dana had told him to leave them. That restraint bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Dana stepped from a county SUV wearing a dark forest green uniform, black boots, and the expression of someone who had learned not to hurry, simply because everyone around her wanted answers. At 56, she was compact and square-shouldered, with brown hair beginning to silver around the temples and a stainless steel thermos wedged into the cup holder behind her. She looked first at Nolan, then at Rook, then at the old truck. You touched anything since yesterday? The puppy. I gathered that. Nolan pointed beneath the shelter. Everything else is where it was. Dana crouched beside the water bowl without picking it up. She studied the towel, and the sheltered patch of ground where Piper had been lying. This doesn't look like dumping. That's what I thought. Dana glanced up. Thinking is allowed. Deciding is where I start charging admission. Nolan let that pass. A county animal control officer arrived shortly afterward with a handheld chip scanner. Piper's identification came back under one name: Franklin Voss, 74 years old, North Mill Road, Stonebridge Hollow. Dana did not look surprised. Nolan did. You knew he had a dog? I knew he'd mentioned getting one. Dana straightened. I didn't know this was the one. By the time they returned to Nolan's house, Piper had overturned the empty food dish, dragged half a towel through the pen, and fallen asleep on top of it. Rook lay outside the panels, chin on his paws. The instant Dana entered, Piper lifted her head. She did not rush her. Instead, she looked to Rook, watched him remain calm, then sat awkwardly against the pen wall. Dana studied the puppy for a moment. Franklin got her less than a week before he disappeared. Nolan looked over. From where? Friend of his outside the county. Small working line litter. Franklin had been talking about getting another dog for months. Dana took out her phone and showed Nolan a photo from the missing person file. Franklin Voss stood beside an old farm gate, thin but upright, white hair blown sideways by the wind, one hand resting on Piper's small back. The picture was dated 6 days before Franklin vanished. Nolan looked from the photograph to this puppy. Same pale sable coat, same oversized paws, same half-folded ear. So she's his. Unless another 74-year-old Franklin Voss bought the same puppy last week. Nolan glanced at Dana. You rehearse these? Only for people who ask questions with answers in front of them. Dana's tone changed when she put the phone away. Franklin had been missing for 3 days. His bank accounts had not been touched. There had been no forced entry at his home, no threatening calls that investigators knew of, and no reason to believe he had planned a trip. More importantly, Franklin had been due at Dana's office at 9 Friday morning. He had requested the meeting himself. He never arrived. What was the meeting about? Nolan asked. He said he had information about a public safety concern. What kind? He didn't tell me over the phone. Nolan stared at her. And nobody thought that mattered when he disappeared? Dana's hazel eyes held his. It mattered. Which is why I opened a missing person investigation before the usual waiting period people imagine exists. Nolan knew the correction was deserved, but it still scraped against the part of him that believed unanswered danger should produce immediate movement. Dana seemed to read it. You're helping because Rook found the puppy and because Franklin left her somewhere unusual. That does not make you part of my department. Understood. I've worked with enough former military men to know that word can mean several things. This version means understood. We'll see. Franklin's farm sat north of town, where the road rose above Graywater Valley, and the houses thinned into pasture. Dana drove ahead. Nolan followed with Rook in the back, and Piper secured in a small travel crate he had borrowed from animal control. The farm itself was modest, an old white house with a deep porch, a red equipment shed, a detached garage, and several acres of grass fading toward late summer brown. No dramatic isolation, no boarded windows, No obvious sign that anything had happened there. Dana unlocked the front door with a key supplied by Franklin's nearest relative, then stepped aside while Nolan brought Piper out. The puppy's reaction came before Nolan could put any meaning on the place. Piper twisted in his arms, put her front paws against his chest, and stared at the porch. When he lowered her, she hurried toward the steps with the clumsy urgency of a dog too young to coordinate speed with direction. She reached the first step, stopped, and looked back once at Rook. Rook moved forward. Piper climbed the rest. A small brass bell hung inside the entryway, attached to a leather strap near the door frame. Dana opened the door wide enough for them to enter. The bell gave one soft ring. Piper froze. Her folded ear lifted as far as it could. Then she whined and hurried across the threshold. She did not explore the room like a strange place. She went directly to a faded rug beside an armchair, circled once and looked toward the hall. Nolan felt the question settle differently in him. Until that moment, Franklin Voss had been a name attached to a missing person report. The puppy made him into someone who had expected to come home. The house supported that impression everywhere they looked. Franklin's morning medication remained divided in a plastic organizer beside the kitchen sink. A grocery list on the counter included eggs, oatmeal, batteries, and Piper food, same kind underlined twice. One clean coffee cup rested upside down on a towel instead of being returned to the cupboard. A paperback lay face down beside the living room chair, held open around the middle. On the refrigerator, Franklin had circled an appointment for Piper at the local veterinary clinic the following Wednesday. Dana photographed each item. Nolan stood in the kitchen doorway, resisting the urge to turn ordinary objects into certainty. People left books open. People forgot medication. People changed plans. But taken together, the house did not feel like a place someone had prepared to leave for days. Piper went from the rug to a low cabinet, sniffed around it, then returned to the hall and sat. Rook followed at a distance, less interested in the rooms than in Piper's confidence inside them. Nolan watched the older dog watch the younger one. Rook was not searching yet. He was learning what belonged. Dana led them into Franklin's study. Here the house changed. The room was narrow and crowded with maps, binders, old survey instruments, pencils, and enlarged photographs of concrete piers disappearing into river water. Nolan recognized Graywater Bridge immediately. Everyone in Stonebridge Hollow did. It was the main crossing between the old western side of town and the hospital district to the east. Nolan drove over it often enough without giving it more thought than any other piece of road. Franklin apparently had. Photographs covered one wall. Expansion joints, stone abutments, water lines, concrete surfaces marked with dates and measurement arrows. Several images focused on a single support identified in Franklin's notes as Pier 2. Dana opened a folder without removing anything. He was a structural and hydrology engineer before retirement, worked for the county, then consulted on bridge and flood control projects. Nolan looked around. So the public safety concern was the bridge. Maybe. Dana's answer came too quickly for him. You don't think so? I think we have photographs of a bridge in a retired engineer's office. I'll become more dramatic when the evidence earns it. Nolan turned to the wall beside the desk. A large topographic map covered nearly 12 miles of Graywater River. 7 locations had been circled by hand. One was G7. Others read G2, G4, N1, BR6, HW, and one symbol Nolan could not make out from where he stood. Lines connected some of them, but not in a clean sequence. This was not a man staring at a single damaged pier. Franklin had been looking upstream and downstream, across roads, drainage channels, and sections of land Nolan rarely had reason to visit. "That's a lot of river for a bridge problem," Nolan said. Dana stepped beside him. "That's the first thing you've said today I agree is interesting." Nolan looked at her. "I'm improving." "Don't rush it." Rook had been waiting near the doorway. Dana glanced toward the dog, then to Nolan. "Can he work from an article?" "If the scent is good enough. But after 3 days and with other people through the house, I'm not promising anything." "Good. I don't want promises." Dana located a pair of Franklin's outdoor work boots beside the mudroom entrance. Nolan let Rook take the scent from the leather without turning the exercise into theater. "Find Franklin." Rook lowered his nose, moved through the hall, paused at the study, then continued toward the back of the house. Piper tried to follow immediately. Nolan caught her soft lead before she tangled herself around a chair leg. "Not you." Piper objected with a small sound. Rook stopped at the doorway and looked back. "Check back." Nolan lifted the lead slightly. "Go." Rook continued. The dog led them through the mudroom and into the detached garage, where the air smelled of cut grass, old oil, and dry lumber. Franklin's pickup was absent, leaving an empty rectangle between a workbench and a stack of lumber. Dana already knew the truck had been recovered elsewhere, but the empty space gave the fact physical weight. Rook moved along the workbench, then stopped near a metal shelving unit. 6 plastic sample bottles stood in a row. Each had been labeled in Franklin's block handwriting: G2, G4, G7, N1, BR6, HW. Beside HW was a clean ring in the dust, where a 7th container had apparently sat. Nolan did not touch it. "Missing sample." Dana photographed the shelf. "Or an empty place." Nolan looked at her. "You enjoy this?" "Preventing people from marrying their first theory?" "Very much." The partial answer created a better question. Franklin had not simply been photographing Graywater Bridge. He had been collecting material from several points across the valley, and one sample was no longer with the others. Dana called in the locations to her office for mapping. Nolan walked back toward the study while Rook remained near the garage shelf, nose moving slowly along the lower edge. He had done what Nolan needed him to do. Not solve the puzzle, only show where Franklin's recent work had concentrated. Piper, meanwhile, had become fascinated by a broom bristle and was attempting to bite it. The contrast almost made Nolan laugh. 2 German shepherds, one working a scent problem and one losing an argument with household cleaning equipment. Back in the study, Dana searched the desk under the authority of the active missing person case, while Nolan stayed where she could see him. He disliked that arrangement on principle. He disliked more that Dana had a point. A small digital recorder sat beneath a stack of field notebooks. Dana checked the date stamp. The last file had been made Thursday night. Franklin's voice entered the quiet study thinly through the tiny speaker. "Pier 2 moved another 3 millimeters. That alone doesn't prove much. But if gauge 7 is right, the bridge isn't where the problem starts. The water is changing from..." The recording stopped. Nolan felt his attention tighten. "Someone came in." Dana looked at the device. "Based on what?" He stopped in the middle of the sentence. "So do I when I remember I left the stove on." He was documenting measurements. And? Nolan knew the answer he wanted to give. People did not stop halfway through something important without a reason. But that was not evidence. Dana pressed play again. No second voice, no impact, no sudden sound. Franklin simply stopped recording. Nolan exhaled through his nose. "Fine," Dana gave him a sideways look. "That physically hurt you, didn't it?" "A little." That was the first re-hook Nolan had not expected. The recording answered one question. Franklin had been actively monitoring Pier 2, but immediately made the bridge smaller rather than larger. The bridge wasn't where the problems started. Nolan looked again at the wall map. 7 points, 6 samples, 1 missing. G7 tied to Piper. Franklin had been following something through the valley. Piper broke the tension by suddenly leaving the broom alone and trotting toward a low shelf. She nosed beneath a stack of folded maps and pawed once at the baseboard. Nolan moved the maps aside, expecting another toy. Instead, a small brass whistle rolled out and clicked against the floor. Piper's entire posture changed. She looked at it, then at Nolan. Dana picked it up after photographing where it had been. "Recognize this?" Nolan shook his head. Dana gave 3 short whistles. Piper turned immediately and hurried toward her. Not elegantly, she nearly stepped on her own lead, recovered, and stopped within a few feet of Dana with her attention fixed upward. Her tail moved quickly. Dana lowered the whistle. Nolan looked at Piper. "That one means something. Looks like recall training. Basic. She's 7 weeks old. Basic is ambitious." Piper sat because her rear end seemed to arrive on the floor before the rest of her had decided what to do. Nolan crouched and rubbed the side of her neck. The yellow G7 strip was still secured through her collar. He pictured Franklin at the maintenance shelter. A temporary bowl, food, a towel, a puppy too young to safely accompany him wherever he intended to go next. 3 whistle blasts already being taught as a way to call her back. Then the marker made more sense. If he left her at the maintenance spur, Nolan said, he needed some way to connect her to where he was working if she got loose. Dana looked at the flag. G7. A county worker finds a puppy near an old site, sees the station code. At least they know where to start. Dana considered it rather than agreeing immediately. Possible. Nolan almost corrected her, then stopped. Possible was enough. Franklin had tied the marker carefully. He had left water and food. Nothing suggested he intended Piper to stay there overnight. Whatever he had planned after leaving the maintenance shelter, he had expected to come back. That realization disturbed Nolan more than the unfinished recording. It was easier to imagine a man leaving deliberately than a man making ordinary preparations for his return and simply failing to appear. Dana moved toward the wall map again. Piper followed the whistle in her hand until Rook stepped into the room. The puppy changed direction immediately and pressed against his front leg. Rook smelled the top of her head, then looked toward Nolan. There was no mystery in that exchange. Piper had recognized home. Rook had accepted that her distress now belonged partly to him. Nolan felt the relationship shifting without anyone deciding it should. "Look at this," Dana said. She had lifted the map carefully from one lower corner. On the reverse side, Franklin had written 2 lines in red carpenter pencil. "Don't start with the bridge. Below it, follow the water." Dana read them twice. Nolan looked at the 7 marked locations. What exactly was Franklin following? "I know who might tell us." Dana called Judith Crane. Judith arrived less than an hour later in a dusty sedan that looked as though it had spent much of its life parked beside creeks. At 67, she was lean, lightly weathered, with silver hair cut short and rectangular reading glasses hanging from a thin black cord. She wore a muted sage work shirt, gray field pants, and the expression of someone mildly offended that the world had created a technical problem without consulting her first. Dana introduced her as a retired county hydrologist and former colleague of Franklin's. Judith looked briefly at Nolan, longer at Rook, and longest at Piper. So he finally got the dog. You knew? Dana asked. He talked about it for 6 months. Franklin could make choosing a puppy sound like procurement for a dam project. Piper sniffed Judith's boot and lost interest. Judith entered the study. The humor left her face when she saw the map. She did not begin with Pier 2. She went straight to the 7 circles. Where did you find this? Here, Dana said. Of course you did. Franklin never believed in filing anything where another human being would think to look. She put on her glasses. Nolan pointed to N1. What is that? Judith traced the line upstream with one finger. North monitoring point. Near North Ridge? Below it. North Ridge aggregate? Judith nodded. Nolan knew the quarry. Everyone did. It supplied crushed stone and construction material across the county, and its trucks were part of the background noise of Stone Bridge Hollow. So Franklin thought the quarry was affecting the river. Judith looked over her glasses at him. No. You just said... I said N1 sits below the quarry. That is geography, not guilt. Dana's mouth moved slightly at one corner. Nolan ignored her. Judith pointed to G7, then G4, then another location near the bridge. Franklin had been calling me about flow changes for months. Short events, fast rises after storms. Not enough in the averages to frighten anyone, but he hated averages when the peaks were what mattered. What was causing them? If I knew that, Franklin wouldn't have needed 7 monitoring points. She shifted to the symbol marked HW. Her finger stopped there. Nolan noticed. What's HW? Holloway Weir. Another gauge? No. Judith stood straighter. Older than most of what you're looking at. Nolan glanced again toward N1. If the quarry isn't the starting point, then what is? Judith took off her glasses and let them hang against her shirt. I didn't say the quarry wasn't involved. Then what are you saying? Judith looked toward the window, where the land beyond Franklin's fields fell away toward Graywater Valley. I'm saying Franklin wasn't studying one bridge. He was trying to understand why the river reaches that bridge differently than it used to. The room went quiet. Dana looked at the map. Nolan looked at Piper, curled now beside Rook's front legs in the doorway. 3 days earlier, Franklin Voss had been expected at the sheriff's office with a public safety concern. Instead, he had left a young dog at an old maintenance shelter, marked her collar with the code of a deactivated gauge station, collected samples from miles of river, and disappeared before explaining what he believed connected them. Nolan pointed to N1 again. This is where we go next? Judith did not answer immediately. She placed one finger over North Ridge aggregate, then another over HW. Maybe. Nolan waited. Judith looked at him. But if you decide the quarry is the villain before we look at the water, you'll make the same mistake everybody makes. What mistake? Choosing the answer before the river gets a chance to give you one. She tapped HW. And Franklin marked this for a reason. Outside the study, Piper woke as Rook stood. The older shepherd looked back toward Nolan before leaving the doorway. Check back. Nolan had spent the morning wanting Franklin's disappearance to narrow into something he could pursue. Instead, Franklin's house had done the opposite. The missing man had not left behind one problem. He had left behind a map of an entire valley. By mid-morning the next day, Nolan had already learned that Graywater Bridge meant something different depending on which side of it a person stood. Judith Crane insisted they begin at the hospital instead of the bridge itself. Franklin spent half his career reminding engineers that water doesn't care about county lines, she said. You might as well learn that people don't care about load tables when they're waiting for an ambulance. Dana drove. Nolan sat in the passenger seat with Franklin's marked map folded inside a clear evidence sleeve between them, while Judith occupied the back with a stack of photocopied notes and the permanent expression of someone who had already found 3 things wrong with the morning. Rook stayed at Nolan's house with Piper until the field portion began later. Nolan had arranged for a neighbor he trusted to check on the puppy, and Rook had watched him leave with a calmness that somehow felt more judgmental than barking would have. The drive over Graywater Bridge took less than 2 minutes. Nolan had crossed it hundreds of times without seeing much beyond steel rails, faded lane markings, and the river flashing below. Now he noticed everything. The slight vibration beneath the tires when a dump truck passed in the opposite direction. The patched joints. The concrete pier standing in the current near midspan. Pier 2. On the eastern side, Graywater Regional Hospital rose above a cluster of clinics and medical offices. Dr. Evelyn Hart met them near the ambulance entrance rather than in an office. At 61, she had a narrow, composed face, dark hair threaded with silver, tortoiseshell glasses, and a deep teal cardigan over an ivory blouse despite the heat outside. She walked quickly enough that Nolan had to match her pace. "If you're here to ask whether I want a dangerous bridge left open," she said, "the answer is no." Judith gave Nolan a sideways glance. Evelyn continued, "If you're here to ask whether closing the only direct route from West Stonebridge creates another safety problem, the answer is also no. It creates 6. She led them to a wall map used for emergency routing. Red lines marked ambulance coverage. One station sat west of Graywater River, the hospital east of it. If the bridge closed, an ambulance responding from the western neighborhoods would have to travel south to the next usable crossing and then double back north. "Best conditions, 22 extra minutes," Evelyn said. "Heavy rain, farm traffic, or a road closure, more." Dana asked, "Can you stage an ambulance west of the bridge?" "Temporarily, not indefinitely. Staff, fuel, medications, maintenance. We can improvise for a day. Longer than that becomes another system." Evelyn tapped a series of blue dots representing patients with recurring treatment schedules. Dialysis, cardiac rehab, oncology follow-ups, older people who don't drive after dark. People who already organize their week around this bridge. Nolan studied the map. The conversation had shifted the problem without weakening it. Franklin had been worried about a structure. Evelyn was worried about all the lives that had quietly arranged themselves around that structure remaining usable. "How many people over 65 live west of the river?" Nolan asked. Evelyn gave him a number higher than he expected. "And before you ask, no. We don't have enough beds to move everyone vulnerable over here because the weather might turn bad." "I wasn't going to ask that." "You were." Nolan glanced at Judith. "Does everyone in town do this?" "Only when you make it easy." Evelyn's mouth nearly formed a smile. From the hospital, Judith took them to a senior transportation center 2 blocks away. The building was plain brick, with a row of small buses parked outside, and a bulletin board covered in pharmacy schedules, grocery trips, and medical appointments. Nolan had expected policy. What he got were names. an 81-year-old widower who crossed the bridge twice a week because his cardiologist practiced beside the hospital. Two sisters in their 70s who lived together west of the river and used the senior shuttle because neither drove anymore. A former teacher who said, without drama, that the bridge was how she reached the pharmacy before closing when her prescriptions changed. None of them argued that the bridge should remain open if it was unsafe. That was what struck Nolan. They simply wanted the people making the decision to understand what "close it" meant after the barricades went up. By noon, he understood why Russell Keene had been able to oppose Franklin's requests without automatically being reckless. On the southern edge of town, they stopped briefly at a farm where harvest equipment stood beneath a long, open shed. The owner, a man nearing 70 with dust worked permanently into the creases of his hands, listened while Dana explained that no closure had been ordered. "If you close Graywater for 3 weeks in September," he said, "I don't lose 3 weeks. I lose the buyer who can get produce from somebody else." He nodded toward the eastern road. "I'm not asking you to put trucks on a bad bridge. I'm asking you not to pretend there's no cost when you take them off." Nolan had spent much of his adult life thinking in terms of acceptable risk. Missions were full of it, but there had usually been a defined objective and a chain of command. Stonebridge Hollow offered neither luxury. Here, making one group safer could shift risk onto another group that had never entered the original calculation. Russell Keene met them that afternoon at Harbor Ridge Infrastructure's temporary project office near the Western Bridge approach. He was 52, broad through the shoulders, clean-shaven, with light brown hair graying at the sides, and a dark navy work jacket that still looked presentable after a morning around construction equipment. A silver mechanical pencil rested in his shirt pocket. Nolan disliked how normal he looked. Some part of him had expected a man who had denied 2 urgent inspection requests to advertise the fact through arrogance. Russell instead shook Dana's hand, greeted Judith by name, and offered Nolan the same measured attention he gave everyone else. "Franklin brought you into this?" Russell asked. "Franklin is missing," Dana said. "That brought all of us into it." Russell's expression tightened. "I heard." "Then you also know we're reviewing what he was working on." "You should." No defensiveness. No attempt to end the conversation. Russell laid 3 inspection reports across a folding table. He explained that Graywater Bridge had known wear, aging expansion joints, surface deterioration, and scour around Pier 2 that required monitoring. Franklin had asked Harbor Ridge to support an immediate independent inspection twice in the previous 4 months. Russell had declined both requests. "Why?" Nolan asked. Russell looked at him. "Because the readings we had did not justify closing or heavily restricting the bridge." Franklin thought they did. Franklin thought they justified treating the worst reasonable scenario as if it were already happening. Judith leaned over the reports. "That's not exactly what he said. It's exactly how he worked." Russell's tone remained even. He asked what could happen if peak flow hit the upper estimate, if scour accelerated, if the pier moved beyond trend, if heavy traffic continued through the same window. "Those are legitimate questions, but I manage the bridge that exists today, not the bridge inside every possible bad week." Nolan felt the old instinct arrive, the desire to decide what kind of man Russell was before the conversation ended. And if his worst reasonable case was right? Russell did not flinch. "Then I'm wrong." "That simple?" "No. Nothing about this is simple. If I shut down a bridge every time a conservative model produced an uncomfortable edge case, this county would stop functioning." Judith picked up one of Franklin's earlier requests. And if you normalize every warning because shutting down is inconvenient? Russell looked at her for a long moment. Then one day inconvenience becomes the reason nobody acts. The answer surprised Nolan. Russell was not blind to the argument against him. That made him harder to dismiss. Judith tapped the report. Franklin worked from worst reasonable case. You work from most probable case. Most days, most probable keeps public systems operating. Judith nodded once. And both approaches can look responsible until the day one of you is wrong. That was the rehook Nolan had not expected. The meeting produced no lie to expose, no forged report, no hidden confession. Harbor Ridge's records matched the county's. The scour measurements existed. The wear was documented. Franklin's requests were logged. Russell's denials were logged too. The disagreement was visible in plain sight. Nolan walked out more unsettled than if Russell had tried to hide something. A dishonest man could be confronted. A competent man making a defensible decision from incomplete information was a different problem entirely. They collected Rook from Nolan's house before heading upstream. Piper tried to follow them to the door, got one forepaw tangled briefly in the edge of her pen mat, and then became distracted by the rubber ball she had failed to conquer the day before. Nolan crouched beside her for a moment. "You're staying." Piper put both front paws against the panel. Rook came to Nolan's side, then turned toward the puppy. He lowered his nose through the gap. Piper pressed her muzzle against his. Rook stayed there for 2 seconds before moving away. It was a small exchange, but Nolan noticed Piper did not whine when Rook left this time. The older dog had begun teaching her something Nolan could not put into words yet. Leaving and abandoning were not the same thing. Nolan wished the distinction came as naturally to people. N1 lay several miles upstream from Graywater Bridge, below the broad property of North Ridge Aggregate. The quarry itself could be heard before it was clearly visible. Distant machinery, reversing alarms, the occasional low grind of trucks moving stone. Judith carried a copy of Franklin's map. Dana had obtained permission for them to inspect the public service corridor bordering the site, and Nolan brought one of Franklin's work gloves sealed earlier at the house as a scent article for Rook. "Same rules as yesterday," Dana said. "The dog finds where Franklin went. The dog does not become a hydrologist." Nolan clipped a long working line to Rook's charcoal harness. "He charges extra for consulting." Judith adjusted her glasses. Still probably cheaper than the county. Nolan let Rook smell the glove, then gave the command. Rook moved toward the river first. The ground there was damp beneath cottonwoods, and the recent storm had left shallow pools in the tire tracks. Nolan followed several yards behind, line loose enough to let Rook choose. For the first 100 yards, the dog worked steadily. Then, near a fork where the lower service track followed the bank and a higher road climbed along the hillside, Rook slowed. Nolan had already studied Franklin's map. N1 sat near the water. The lower route made sense. He angled his body toward it and gave Rook room. Rook took 4 steps down the lower track, stopped, raised his head, and turned uphill. Nolan waited. Rook moved toward the higher road. "River's down here," Nolan said quietly. Rook stopped and looked back. Nolan indicated the lower path again. The shepherd approached it, smelled the wet gravel, then turned away a second time. Judith stood behind Nolan with the map folded beneath one arm. "It appears you are not the only person with a theory. He's following scent, not debating me. Then perhaps let him." Nolan's hand tightened slightly on the line. Every practical instinct told him Franklin had gone toward the monitoring point beside the river. He could see the route. He could explain it. The dog could not explain anything. That did not make Nolan right. For a moment, he felt the same irritation he had felt at the shelter when Rook blocked him from approaching Piper too quickly. The urge was almost embarrassingly familiar. Take control, reduce uncertainty, make the next step happen. Then he looked at Rook. The shepherd was not confused. He was waiting. Nolan released several feet of line. "All right, show me." Rook turned uphill immediately. The high-service road curved around a graded slope bordering the newer section of the quarry property. Franklin's scent was intermittent, but Rook kept working forward, pausing twice near weeds at the road edge before continuing. About 200 yards later, he stopped beside a steel guardrail and lowered his nose toward a muddy boot print sheltered beneath it. Dana crouched beside the print, while Nolan held Rook back. The tread pattern was consistent with Franklin's outdoor boots, though Dana was careful not to call it proof on the spot. Rook had accomplished something more useful than proving ownership. He had established that Franklin had likely taken the higher route. Judith was no longer looking at the ground. She was staring over the guardrail. Below them, a broad concrete drainage channel descended from the developed side of the quarry and emptied into a smaller tributary feeding Graywater River. Rainwater still moved through it in a brown, fast ribbon from the previous storm. "That wasn't on Franklin's old watershed map," she said. Dana looked over. "Illegal?" "I didn't say that." Judith walked to a posted project sign near the service gate and read the permit reference number. She called the county planning's office from the roadside. The answer took several minutes. The drainage system was permitted, approved, inspected. Nolan watched the water. "So we found nothing." Judith turned. "I didn't say that either." The permit drawings had been based on a hydrology model completed 7 years earlier. At the time, the quarry's developed footprint had been smaller. So had the residential subdivision north of Stonebridge Hollow. Several roads now paved had still been gravel. Additional storm drains had been installed in stages. None of those projects was necessarily improper. Each had been evaluated individually. Judith took Franklin's map from her bag and spread it across the hood of Dana's SUV. "This is the part people hate," she said. Nolan looked at the drainage channel, then the map. "What part?" "The part where everyone can follow the rules and the system can still change." She pointed to the quarry expansion. "This gets modeled." Then to the subdivision. "This gets modeled." A road. "This gets modeled." Another drainage project. "This too." Her finger circled the wider Graywater watershed. "But if nobody comes back and asks what all of them do together, each approval can be correct inside its own little box, while the river gets a completely different answer." Nolan looked downhill at the tributary carrying stormwater toward Graywater. Franklin was checking the boxes against the whole system. Maybe. Judith refused certainty as stubbornly as Dana did. Nolan almost smiled. "Do you two practice saying that?" "No," Dana said. "We just enjoy watching you suffer." The quiet humor passed quickly. Nolan looked toward Rook. The dog had settled beside the SUV, panting lightly after working the slope. Nolan crouched and offered water from a collapsible bowl. Rook drank, then lifted his head toward the road they had followed. Nolan rubbed the thick fur behind the dog's ear. "You were right." Rook drank again, unimpressed. The admission felt different from surrender. Nolan had not stopped thinking. He had not stopped taking responsibility. He had simply allowed another source of information to override a plan that looked obvious to him. The result sat below them in concrete and moving water. Dana's phone rang. She stepped away from the SUV while Judith continued comparing Franklin's symbols against the current drainage map. Nolan heard Dana say, "Where?" Her voice changed. He stood. Dana listened for another 15 seconds, then ended the call. They found Franklin's pickup. Nolan's attention sharpened. At Station 14? No. Where? Old Maintenance Road several miles west of it. Franklin. Dana shook her head. The truck was locked. No sign of him around it. The question that had followed them since Piper's shelter shifted again. Franklin had driven away from the puppy. He had moved through multiple monitoring points. He had apparently passed the quarry drainage system. Then his truck had ended up near another service corridor, while Franklin himself remained missing. Dinah continued. There's a map on the passenger seat. Judith folded Franklin's copy under her arm. Can your deputy read the markings? He already sent a photo. Dana turned her phone around. 7 locations were marked on the map inside Franklin's pickup. 6 had pencil strokes through them. 1 remained circled heavily in red. Holloway Weir. Judith's expression changed in a way Nolan had not seen all day. Not fear, recognition. You know it, Nolan said. Yes. A dam? Not exactly. What then? An old flow control structure. Nolan pointed toward the water below the quarry. Still operating? Judith looked at the red circle on Dana's phone for several seconds before answering. It's supposed to be. They returned to Franklin's house before sunset to compare the map from the pickup with the older engineering sheets in his study. Piper was asleep on the living room rug when they entered, her pale body tucked against Rook's usual place, even though Rook had only just returned. When she heard him, she opened both eyes, rose, and stumbled toward him. Rook stopped inside the doorway. Piper reached him and leaned briefly against his chest before immediately discovering one of Nolan's bootlaces. Nolan let out a breath he had not known he was holding. The day had expanded Franklin's problem far beyond one missing man, but Piper still reduced part of it to something painfully simple. Her person had gone out expecting to return. She was still waiting. Judith opened a cabinet in Franklin's study and found an older map of the Holloway system. 2 controlled outlets were clearly marked. Franklin had circled both. Then Nolan noticed the red pencil. A 3rd line had been drawn away from the structure, bending through an area labeled only with old field boundaries. What's that? Judith took the map. Her eyes moved between the old drawing and Franklin's newer river map. That route isn't on the current sheets. Was it ever? Judith did not answer immediately. Dana stepped closer. Finally, Judith touched the faded line with one finger. It used to carry water away from the main channel. Nolan looked at Franklin's red circle around Holloway Weir. And now? Judith folded the map only halfway. That, she said, is what we need to find out. The faded line on Franklin Voss's old Holloway drawing looked too small to carry the weight Judith Crane gave it. Nolan stood beside her in Franklin's study, while Dana Whitlock held the newer county map open on the desk. On the older sheet, Holloway Weir had 2 marked control outlets and a 3rd shallow route bending east through fields before returning to Graywater River downstream. On the current map, that 3rd route was gone. No dotted line, no drainage label, nothing. Judith traced the vanished path with one finger. North Cut. Nolan looked at the faded boundaries around it. A canal? Not exactly. More like an overflow channel that engineers learned to use instead of fighting. When gray water rose hard enough, Holloway could send part of the flow through here, away from Pier 2. Among other things. Dana turned the current map 90 degrees and aligned it with the old one. Northcutt had once crossed open farmland. Now a residential development occupied part of the area. A service road cut another section. Parcel lines had multiplied where there had once been only fields. Judith looked almost offended by the geography. 40 years ago, nobody had to explain to water that Stonebridge Hollow intended to grow. Nolan leaned closer. So somebody filled it in. Judith gave him the same look she had given him at North Ridge when he wanted the quarry to become an answer too quickly. That sentence already has a villain hiding inside it. It's a channel. It used to exist. Now it doesn't. Parts of it still exist. Parts changed. That isn't the same thing as one person waking up and deciding to erase a river. She folded the old map carefully. If Franklin was right, that distinction matters. By 10 that morning, Dana had them inside the County Public Works Archive, a low brick building behind the administration offices, where the air smelled faintly of paper, dust, and old carpet. Nolan had expected shelves and filing cabinets. What he found looked more like several decades of Stonebridge Hollow arguing with itself about where to put things. Flat map drawers lined one wall. Boxes carried handwritten project numbers. Metal cabinets had been relabeled so many times that 3 generations of stickers showed beneath the newest ones. Marla Denton, 69, came through a side door with a ring of keys making a soft metallic rhythm at her hip. She was small, silver-haired, and wore a dusty blue-gray cardigan over a cream blouse patterned with tiny blue leaves. Reading glasses rested low on her nose. Dana introduced her as the former Public Works Secretary, who still worked 3 mornings a week because, according to Marla, retirement had failed to improve the filing system. "Franklin Voss," Dana said. Marla stopped moving. "You found him?" "Not yet." The hope left her face without turning into panic. She nodded once and set a cardboard folder on the counter. "Then you're here because of Northcutt." Nolan looked at Judith. Judith looked at Marla. "How did you know?" Marla gave them both an impatient glance. Because Franklin spent 6 years telling anyone who would listen that Northcutt was being treated like an inconvenience instead of part of a drainage system. And because he was here 3 weeks ago asking me whether a document could disappear without anybody actually removing it. That changed the room. Nolan stepped closer. "Disappear how?" "Bad code. Wrong project family. A scanned document attached to the wrong case. Pick your favorite." Did he think someone had moved it? Franklin thought computers were machines designed to hide paper from people who already knew where the paper was. Marla looked toward the cabinets. He was not entirely wrong. The local goal became simple to say and difficult to execute. Find the report Franklin believed had vanished, then determine what it actually said about Northcutt. Marla remembered the document because Franklin had written it 6 years earlier after a proposed subdivision expansion and a change to the service road near Holloway. Judith remembered the argument, but not the final filing number. Dana requested access to the archived project database. Nolan waited while the 3 women searched categories whose names meant almost nothing to him. Flood control modifications, drainage accommodation, roadway improvements, residential runoff management. His instinct was to reduce the problem. Find the year. Find Franklin's name. Search every file. Marla explained why that would not work. Older scanned records had inconsistent metadata. Some had been uploaded under contractors rather than authors. Others existed only as image files with no searchable text. This Nolan said, looking at the cabinets, is how civilizations end. Marla adjusted her glasses. Usually civilizations end after somebody ignores the secretary. Judith made a quiet sound that might have been a laugh. For nearly an hour, the search went nowhere. Then Marla stopped asking what Franklin would have named the report and started asking what the clerk who processed it would have believed the project was about. She pulled an index from a drawer labeled Landscape Site Drainage. Franklin hated this department name, she said. Why? Because it made a flood problem sound like somebody needed prettier gutters. Halfway down the page, her finger stopped at a 6-year-old entry associated with a residential landscaping permit, rather than flood control. The author field was blank. The project notes mentioned North Cut edge grading. Judith went still. The report had not been destroyed. It had not been hidden by Harbor Ridge, the quarry, or anyone else. A former records clerk had attached Franklin's hydrology memorandum to landscape drainage instead of flood control, likely because the permit package involved earthwork around the new residential development. Anyone searching Franklin's name under bridge safety or watershed modeling would never have found it. Marla pulled the scanned copy onto an archive monitor. Franklin's language was dry, cautious, and far less dramatic than Nolan expected. He had not predicted a bridge failure. He had not called the development dangerous. He had written that the cumulative loss of flood storage and overflow capacity along North Cut required the county to rerun the watershed model if additional upstream runoff sources were approved. Judith read several lines twice. There. She pointed at the screen. Franklin had listed 3 conditions that mattered together: continued narrowing of North Cut, increased runoff from future quarry expansion, and additional paved development north of town. If those trends continued without a new full basin model, he warned, peak velocity through the Graywater main channel near Pier 2 could exceed assumptions used in earlier structural evaluations. Nolan felt a flash of anger so immediate it surprised him. 6 years. Dana looked over. What? This sat here 6 years. Yes. Because somebody put it in the wrong folder. Marla's face tightened slightly. A person entered one code wrong. Nolan heard himself getting sharper. And nobody caught it. Judith closed the document on the screen and turned toward him. You're doing it again. Doing what? Trying to make the problem fit inside one person. A report mattered. It disappeared. No. It became hard to find. Those are not the same thing. Tell Franklin that. I would if we knew where he was. The reply landed harder than Nolan expected. Judith lowered her voice. You want a face attached to this because a face can be confronted. 6 years of separate decisions are harder. A subdivision gets approved. A road gets widened. A quarry adds drainage. A model gets postponed because the last project met its own requirements. Nobody wakes up planning a dangerous outcome. Nolan looked back at Franklin's memorandum. But the outcome doesn't care what anyone planned. Exactly. That afternoon, Nolan returned home while Dana worked through formal requests for the older Holloway records. The shift from county archives to his own yard should have made the day feel smaller. Instead, Franklin's warning followed him home. Rook waited at the back door when Nolan arrived. Piper was on the other side of the temporary pen, pale sable coat, bright in the late afternoon light, trying to pull a folded towel through a gap narrower than the towel itself. Nolan opened the pen. Piper launched herself toward Rook, reached him, and immediately became interested in a dry leaf blowing across the yard. Rook walked to the back step and stopped. Piper kept going, Rook did not bark or chase her. He simply waited. Piper made it perhaps 15 yards before some part of her noticed that the older dog was no longer beside her. She turned. Rook remained at the step. Piper looked toward the leaf, then back at Rook. Finally, she trotted toward him, ears uneven, paws landing with more enthusiasm than coordination. Rook waited until she reached him, then moved on. Nolan stood beside the door watching. Check back. Piper did not understand it as a rule. Not yet. She was learning because another dog had made staying connected part of moving forward. Nolan reached into his pocket for his phone before consciously deciding to. Mason Reed. The name had remained in his contacts for 3 years. Nolan opened it. No new message. No missed call. Nothing demanding action. That made it harder. He had told himself the silence was respectful. Mason had lost the career he expected to have. Nolan had lived with the knowledge that he had questioned the plan once, then allowed someone else's confidence to close the issue. Mason had never accused him of anything. Somehow that had made calling worse. Nolan stared at the green phone icon. Rook crossed the yard. Piper chased after him, stopped halfway when Rook paused, then corrected herself and returned to his side. Nolan's thumb hovered over Mason's number. He could call. He could hear whatever came next. Or he could wait for some better moment that did not exist. Piper suddenly found a stick and forgot Rook completely. Nolan almost smiled. Work in progress. He locked the phone without calling. Not yet. It was not courage, but it was no longer pretending Mason's name had disappeared from the list. The next morning, Marla called Dana with something she had remembered overnight. Franklin had left an envelope with the Public Works office months earlier. Not evidence, not a legal deposit, just a sealed envelope addressed to himself and marked "Hold with old gauge access." Marla had placed it in a lockbox because Franklin still possessed limited archival access as a retired consultant. Dana met Nolan and Judith at the archive after obtaining authority to open it as part of the missing person investigation. Marla placed the envelope on the counter. He told me if he forgot where he put it, that would prove his point about retirement. Dana opened it. Inside was a small metal key, a photograph of the old Gauge 7 structure, and a folded note written in Franklin's red carpenter pencil. Lower room. Below it. Don't trust the digital series after 2019. Judith took a slow breath. I forgot room existed. Nolan looked at the photograph. Gauge 7 appeared as a squat concrete monitoring structure partly hidden by brush. What lower room? Older gauge stations sometimes kept mechanical recorders, staff gauge logs, calibration sheets, backups. When G7 was deactivated, the digital feeds stopped mattering to most people, but the physical room was never removed. And Franklin had access? Apparently. Dana turned the key over inside the evidence bag. Why distrust the digital series after 2019? Judith shook her head. Could be calibration. Could be sensor placement. Could be Franklin being Franklin. Meaning? He trusted instruments. He just trusted 2 instruments more than one. The note gave them a new action, but not an immediate one. Gauge 7 sat on restricted county property. Dana could not simply take the key and open it, because a retired engineer had written a message. She submitted a formal access request and asked Public Works to confirm the room's status. Nolan hated how slowly permissions moved compared with questions. He said nothing. While they waited, Dana brought in someone who could answer the question none of them had authority to answer. Rebecca Sloan, 54, was the county's current bridge engineer. She arrived carrying a graphite hard-shell clipboard and wearing a navy polo, charcoal field pants, and waterproof work boots. Her dark blonde hair, streaked with silver, was tied low at the back of her neck. Unlike Judith, Rebecca had never worked with Franklin and had no history with Russell Keene. That independence was exactly why Dana wanted her. Rebecca spent more than an hour reading Franklin's 6-year-old memorandum, Harbor Ridge's inspection summaries, Pier 2 measurements, and Judith's notes about the changed watershed. Nolan expected a reaction when she reached Franklin's warning. He got almost none. Rebecca made 2 notes, checked a date, and asked Judith what rainfall series the old model had used. "You think Franklin was right?" Nolan finally asked. Rebecca looked up. "About which part?" "That the bridge needs an emergency inspection." "I haven't said that." "Do you think it's safe?" "I haven't said that either." Nolan could feel Judith enjoying the exchange without looking at her. Rebecca closed one report. "You have a habit of asking for the last sentence before I finish the first page?" "Sometimes." "Break it." Dana concealed a smile behind her thermos. Rebecca went back to the documents. When she finally spoke, she separated the issues with almost clinical precision. Franklin's memorandum did not prove Graywater Bridge was unsafe. It did prove that several hydrologic assumptions underlying previous scour and loading expectations might no longer be reliable if Northcutt had lost capacity and upstream runoff had increased. "Those are different claims," Rebecca said. "One can be true without the other." Nolan leaned against the archive table. "So we're back where we started?" "No." Rebecca tapped Franklin's report. "You started with a bridge that had known wear and an engineer asking for a conservative response. Now you have evidence that the environmental inputs used to interpret that wear may be stale." Judith nodded. "Which means?" Nolan asked. Rebecca met his eyes. "Which means I need current flow behavior before I'm willing to tell anyone the old safety assumptions still hold." It was not the dramatic answer Nolan's instincts wanted. It was worse in another way. The county had not been knowingly driving across a bridge everyone secretly believed was unsafe. It might have been driving across a bridge using numbers that described a version of Graywater River that no longer existed. The access approval for Gauge 7 still had not come through by late afternoon. Nolan found himself pacing once along the archive windows before stopping. Dana noticed. "You know, staring at the parking lot doesn't accelerate government paperwork." "I was checking." "For what?" "Whether bureaucracy was approaching." "You'd hear it. It moves slowly." Marla laughed from behind the counter. The humor broke the pressure without removing it. Nolan looked again at the old Holloway map. The vanished Northcutt. The report filed under the wrong category. Franklin's key. The warning about digital records. None of it told them where Franklin was, but the shape of what he had been doing was becoming clearer. Franklin had not spent his final days before disappearing, trying to prove one bridge was failing. He had been trying to prove that Stonebridge Hollow was still judging Graywater Bridge against a river the town itself had gradually changed. Before Nolan left, Rebecca called him back from the doorway. "I finished the old memorandum." He turned. "Franklin never proved this bridge was unsafe." Nolan waited. For the first time since she arrived, Rebecca's expression looked less neutral. "If that's what you were hoping to find, you didn't." "So we've been chasing the wrong thing." "No." She laid one hand on the report. "He proved something more basic." Nolan came back to the table. Rebecca pointed to the old hydraulic assumptions, then to Franklin's note about North Cut, and to the newer development maps. The numbers being used to call Graywater Bridge safe may no longer describe the river that's actually running beneath it. No one spoke for several seconds. Outside the archive windows, late sunlight lay across Stonebridge Hollow as if nothing had changed. Cars moved toward Graywater Bridge. Trucks crossed it. People headed to the hospital, the pharmacy, farms, homes. The bridge was still carrying the same town. Nolan was beginning to understand that the river beneath it might not be the same river at all. By 9 the next morning, Stonebridge Hollow had stopped treating Graywater Bridge as an engineering problem and started treating it as an argument. Someone had posted part of Franklin Voss's old memorandum online during the night. By breakfast, screenshots were moving through neighborhood groups without the pages that explained what Franklin had actually concluded. One version claimed the bridge had been declared unsafe years ago, and the county had hidden it. Another said environmental activists were trying to shut down the crossing because of runoff from North Ridge aggregate. Neither was true, but truth was slower than fear and less entertaining than certainty. Dana Whitlock called Nolan before he finished feeding Rook. "Town Hall? 11?" Nolan looked through the kitchen door at Piper, who had somehow managed to put one front paw inside her water bowl while drinking. "I'm not on the council." "Congratulations." "On what?" "You still have to come." Dana explained that Rebecca Sloan would present the current technical assessment, Evelyn Hart would speak for the hospital, and Public Works wanted someone who had been part of Franklin's search to explain how the evidence had actually developed. Nolan's first instinct was to refuse. The second was to ask why Dana could not do it. "Because," she said, "I'm going to be busy keeping 300 people from turning a bridge inspection into a family feud." Nolan looked at Rook. The shepherd lifted his head from his bowl. "That sounds like your specialty. Wear the clean jacket." The Stonebridge Hollow Town Hall had space for about 180 people if everyone liked each other. That morning, nearly twice that number tried to get inside. Folding chairs filled the main chamber. People stood along the walls, in the hallway, and outside the open double doors. Nolan recognized farmers, nurses, quarry workers, retired teachers, parents from the Western Subdivision, and several older residents he had seen at the Senior Transportation Center. Graywater River had divided Stonebridge Hollow geographically for generations. By 1115, the bridge across it had begun dividing people in other ways. Dana stood near the front in her dark green uniform, directing deputies to keep the aisles open. Rebecca Sloan arranged printed inspection summaries on a table beside a projected map. Judith Crane sat 2 seats away with her glasses hanging from their cord, and looked as if she would rather be standing knee-deep in a creek than participating in public democracy. Dr. Evelyn Hart arrived from the hospital still wearing her deep teal cardigan, spoke briefly to Donna, then took a seat near the aisle. Russell Keene came in alone and sat where everyone could see him. That choice earned Nolan a small measure of respect he did not especially want to give. The meeting began badly and became useful only because Dana refused to let anyone own the room for too long. A 79-year-old widow stood with both hands on her cane and explained that she crossed Graywater 3 times each week for treatment. "I'm not asking anybody to send me across something dangerous," she said. "I'm asking what happens to people like me if you close it at 5 o'clock and figure out the rest tomorrow." A 70-year-old farmer spoke next. He had a produce contract that depended on trucks reaching the Eastern Highway on schedule. "If heavy vehicles are off that bridge for the whole harvest window, my buyer doesn't wait for the county to solve its feelings. he buys somewhere else. A truck driver from North Ridge stood near the back and said the southern detour pushed loaded vehicles past an elementary school and through two narrow residential turns never designed for that traffic. Residents from those neighborhoods immediately agreed with him, which momentarily surprised everyone. Evelyn took the microphone and kept her statement short. Closing the bridge without staging medical support would add time to ambulance response from the western side. Some patients could be moved ahead of severe weather, others could not. There is no zero-risk option, she said. If anyone in this room has one, I would very much like to see the paperwork. The room quieted enough for Rebecca to speak. She did not tell them Franklin had proved the bridge was unsafe, because he had not. She did not tell them Harbor Ridge had been right to keep it fully open, because the old assumptions were now in question. She explained that Pier 2 had known scour and minor movement under monitoring, while Franklin's recovered report suggested the river's peak behavior might have changed as North Cut lost capacity and upstream runoff increased. Current data was not yet complete. That phrase angered both sides. People who wanted immediate closure heard delay. People who wanted the bridge left alone heard the beginning of a shutdown. Rebecca waited until the noise dropped. I cannot tell you this bridge is about to fail. I also cannot tell you that continuing normal heavy loads is justified, while the assumptions behind the monitoring are being challenged. That was the line no one wanted, and everyone needed. She recommended an emergency load reduction effective that afternoon. Temporary sensors at Pier 2, continuous review of water levels, and preparations for a full closure if measurements crossed a defined threshold. A quarry worker shouted that the county was punishing them over a theory. Someone else shouted that 3 millimeters of movement should have been enough months ago. Dana stood without raising her voice. One person at a time. Or we all discover how slowly I can make this meeting go. Russell asked to speak before the anger settled around him. He did not deny that Franklin had asked twice for an emergency independent inspection. I opposed it, he said. That is in the record. A man near the wall called out, because it would cost your company money. Russell looked toward him. It would. It would also affect emergency access, school traffic, farm transport, and every business routing east. He opened a printed email chain. Nolan recognized county letterhead. Russell handed copies to Dana and Rebecca. The messages were from months earlier, when Harbor Ridge and county officials had discussed possible repair windows. One instruction from the county specifically asked the contractor to preserve at least one lane of traffic whenever engineering conditions allowed, citing hospital access concerns and ambulance routing. Evelyn read the page before speaking. The hospital raised those concerns. The room shifted. Russell did not look relieved. I'm not showing you this because I think it proves I made every decision correctly. I'm showing you because there was pressure in both directions. Judith leaned toward her microphone. Pressure explains a decision. It doesn't validate one. Russell nodded. Agreed. Nolan had expected defensiveness. Russell kept denying him the easier version of the man. Responsibility moved again, not away from Russell, but outward. The contractor had wanted the bridge open. The hospital had wanted access preserved. The county had wanted disruption minimized. Farmers, older residents, and truck routes all depended on the same crossing. Every reasonable concern had pushed the system toward waiting for clearer evidence. Nolan was asked to speak after that, which felt unfair. He stood beside the projected map while too many faces looked back at him, as though being a former Navy SEAL meant he could produce certainty by force of habit. Franklin Voss found the question, Nolan said. Judith Crane helped us understand it. Rebecca Sloan is the engineer deciding what the current data supports. Dana Whitlock is running the missing person investigation. I'm not here to replace any of them. The room became quieter, partly because that was not the speech people expected. Nolan pointed to Graywater Bridge, then the hospital, then the southern detour. If Rebecca says heavy traffic needs to come off the bridge, then we solve what happens after that. We don't pretend the medical problem, traffic problem, or farm problem disappears because the engineering decision is correct. He proposed what had taken shape through conversations over the previous 2 days, rather than presenting it as his own plan. Heavy trucks would be restricted. An ambulance and crew would be staged west of the river during the highest risk period, with another remaining east. The hospital would contact patients with critical recurring appointments and move schedules or arrange temporary stays where practical. The church east of the bridge could serve as an overnight support point if a full closure stranded people away from home. Essential deliveries would receive alternate routing windows. Deputies would control the smaller roads, so detour traffic did not simply flood residential streets. Fire crews would pre-position equipment on both sides. Rebecca's sensor data would be reviewed on a fixed cycle rather than waiting for someone to decide the numbers felt different. A woman near the front asked, "Are you saying the bridge is going to close?" "No." "Then why prepare all that?" Nolan paused. 3 years earlier, that question would have irritated him because the answer seemed obvious. Now he understood why it did not feel obvious to everyone else. Because preparation is cheaper than surprise. A farmer from the western side said Nolan was spreading fear. A man near the hospital said the county was already moving too slowly. Someone asked whether North Ridge should be shut down immediately. Judith said no evidence supported that. Russell was booed when he agreed. Nolan did not try to quiet everyone by winning the argument. That was the change he noticed only after it happened. His instinct still searched for the clean line, the decision everyone would have to accept once he explained it correctly. But the room did not contain one problem. It contained dozens of lives attached to the same piece of infrastructure. The best he could do was help them prepare for a decision that might remain unpopular even if it was right. Dana eventually brought the meeting to a close with the emergency load reduction approved for immediate implementation. Outside, workers were already preparing temporary signs for the bridge approaches. Local payoff came without satisfaction. Stonebridge Hollow had taken its first concrete safety step, and half the town still thought it was either too much or not enough. The access authorization for Gauge 7 arrived shortly after 2. Dana, Judith, Rebecca, and Nolan drove to the deactivated station, while Public Works sent a technician to meet them. Rook remained at Nolan's house with Piper. This was not a scent search, and Nolan had no reason to turn the shepherd into an accessory for every clue. Gauge 7 stood behind a locked maintenance gate along a brush-covered bend of Graywater, a squat concrete structure half hidden by willow and tall late-summer grass. The key from Franklin's envelope opened an older steel door below the main instrument platform. The lower room smelled of cool concrete, machine oil, and paper that had spent too many seasons near water. Shelves held calibration books, mechanical chart drums, old staff gauge records, and instrument cases nobody had bothered to remove when the station was deactivated. Franklin had been there recently. A folding chair sat beside a portable lamp. 3 notebooks lay inside a plastic storage bin with his red carpenter pencil clipped across the top. Judith opened the first notebook and immediately stopped talking. Franklin had spent nearly 3 years manually comparing short-duration water level peaks against the county's digital series. The official data was not fabricated. The sensors had not simply failed. The problem was subtler. Digital summaries used in routine review emphasized hourly and daily averages. Franklin's mechanical checks captured brief surges after intense storms, 20 minutes here, 40 minutes there, too short to dominate the averages, but strong enough to matter when repeated against a vulnerable river structure. Rebecca placed Franklin's handwritten charts beside the digital summaries. On several dates, the average rise looked modest. The mechanical trace showed a sharp peak buried inside it. "So the digital data is wrong," Nolan said. Rebecca shook her head. "Not exactly." Judith tapped one narrow spike. "It's answering a different question." Rebecca nodded. "Average tells you what the river generally did. Pure scour cares about what the water did when it was moving hardest." Nolan looked at the old records. And Franklin thought those peaks were getting stronger. "He thought they were getting stronger and arriving differently," Judith said. That's why he kept moving upstream." The discovery should have solved something. Instead, it made the missing data more important. Franklin's notebooks ended with a page headed "Needs Station 14 Confirmation." Under it, he had written a schedule. Thursday, G7, Friday, HW Suck 14, then Dana. Dana stared at the final line. "He meant to come see me after Station 14. Nolan remembered Franklin's empty chair, his untouched medication, Piper left with food for a few hours. The sequence tightened. Franklin had visited G7 Thursday. On Friday he had gone to Holloway, then intended to reach Station 14, collect the final comparison, and bring the result to Dana. Somewhere inside that chain, he disappeared. Rebecca studied the newest mechanical peaks. "This still isn't enough for me to order a full closure." Nolan felt frustration flare. What exactly would be enough? "Current confirmation from another point in the system." She pointed at Franklin's note. Apparently, Franklin thought the same thing. They returned to Nolan's house near dusk because Marla had offered to stay with Piper while the field work continued. Marla sat at the kitchen table sorting copies Dana had authorized her to organize. Piper slept beneath the chair, while Rook lay several feet away facing the back door. The moment Nolan entered, Piper woke and scrambled toward him, then changed direction halfway when Rook stood. Marla smiled. "I believe you rank second." "That's generous." She had been reviewing the digital copies of Franklin's voice memos to see whether any file names matched the notebooks. "There's one I didn't understand," she said. "It's mostly him testing something." She tapped play. Franklin's voice came from the small speaker. "Piper, here." Then 3 short whistle blasts. Piper went still. Her head rose. Marla stopped the recording, startled by the reaction. "Well?" "Play it again," Nolan said. 3 whistle notes. Piper pushed herself upright, hurried toward the back door, and whined once. Rook had been relaxed a moment earlier. Now he rose because Piper had changed. He looked at her, then at Nolan, then back to the door. Nolan crouched beside the puppy. "You know that sound." Piper's tail moved fast, but her attention stayed fixed toward the doorway, as though Franklin might appear on the other side. Rook stepped close enough that Piper leaned briefly against his front leg. It was not evidence of where Franklin was. It was something more limited and therefore more useful. If Franklin still had his whistle, 3 short blasts might be recognized by the one creature he had spent the previous week teaching to come back. Judith arrived 10 minutes later with a weather update on her phone. A storm system forming north of the valley had accelerated. Heavy rain could reach the upper watershed within roughly 18 hours. Station 14 sat deep in the valley beyond reliable cell coverage, near the route where Franklin's truck had been recovered. Dana immediately began organizing a coordinated search for First Light, with the possibility of moving sooner if weather deteriorated. Nolan looked at the map. G7. Holloway. Station 14. The line was no longer theoretical. It was Franklin's final day. "We know he planned to go there," Nolan said. Dana nodded. "We know he wrote that he planned to go there. We still established the route." Nolan did not argue. 2 days earlier, he would have heard caution as delay. Now he heard what Dana intended. Build the search on facts strong enough that people would not waste hours chasing Nolan's favorite theory. Her phone rang before she could finish assigning teams. The caller was with County Traffic Operations. Dana had already asked them to review any service or maintenance cameras covering Franklin's likely route. Most were useless. Old units, bad angles, or recordings automatically overwritten. But Holloway's maintenance gate still had a low-resolution security camera listed in the access records Dana had pulled after they found the old Weir plans. Traffic Operations had recovered the relevant Friday footage. Dana put the call on speaker. Franklin's truck entered the gate area shortly after 7 that morning. It stopped. For nearly 12 minutes, it remained beside another vehicle. Nolan straightened. "Can they identify it?" "Working on the plate." The room went quiet except for Piper worrying the edge of her towel. A still image arrived on Dana's phone. It was grainy but clear enough. Franklin's pickup sat near the Holloway gate. Beside it was a dark company SUV Nolan had seen before. Dana enlarged the rear plate. Russell Keene. Judith removed her glasses. No one spoke for several seconds. The mystery shifted again. Russell had not merely argued with Franklin through reports and emails. He had seen him on the morning Franklin disappeared, and in every conversation since, Russell had never mentioned it. Dana called him. Russell answered on the 4th ring. "Russell, I need you at the sheriff's office." A pause. "Now." Another pause. Dana's expression did not change. "Because I have a photograph of your vehicle beside Franklin Voss's at Holloway Weir on Friday morning." This time the silence carried through the speaker. Nolan looked toward Piper. The puppy had settled against Rook again, unaware that the missing man she was still waiting for had just become connected to the last person Nolan had tried, and failed, to make into a simple answer. 40 minutes later, Russell sat across from Dana in a small interview room at the sheriff's office. Nolan was not inside. He watched through the open observation area only because Dana intended to ask him afterward about anything Russell said regarding the field sites. Russell looked tired rather than frightened. His dark navy jacket was folded over the chair beside him. The silver mechanical pencil that usually sat in his shirt pocket was gone. Dana placed the still image on the table. "Friday morning. Holloway Weir." Russell looked at it, then away. Dana gave him enough time to decide whether silence was helping. Finally, she asked the question Nolan had been carrying since the image appeared. "Why, in 3 days of talking about Franklin Voss, did you never tell us you were the last known person to see him?" Russell's eyes stayed on the photograph. For the first time since Nolan had met him, Russell Keene did not have an answer ready. Russell Keene finally looked up from the photograph on Dana Whitlock's interview room table. For most of the past 3 days, Nolan had seen Russell as a man who always had a reason ready. Why Franklin's inspection request had been too conservative. Why the bridge had remained open. Why the available numbers had supported waiting. Now, for the first time, Russell seemed less certain of his own explanations than of the facts he was about to give. Dana sat across from him without rushing the silence. Nolan remained outside the room where Dana had told him to wait, close enough to be brought in if Russell described a field location Nolan had already seen. Judith Crane stood farther down the hall with her arms folded. Rebecca Sloan was back at the temporary bridge monitoring station reviewing the new Pier 2 sensor feed. Rain tapped lightly against the sheriff's office windows. Not heavy yet, but steady enough to remind everyone that the 18-hour window Judith had mentioned was already shrinking. Russell rubbed a hand across his jaw. "Franklin called me Friday morning," he said at last. "He told me to meet him at Holloway." Dana asked why. "He had new measurements from North Cut. Said if I saw them in person, I'd stop arguing by email." "Did you?" "Stop arguing." Russell gave a tired breath that was almost a laugh. "No." Franklin had brought handwritten readings and photographs showing how little flow was reaching the old overflow channel after recent storms. He wanted Russell to sign a statement supporting an immediate independent bridge inspection. Russell refused. He still believed Franklin had not shown enough to justify the disruption. "Then he showed me the Holloway numbers," Russell said. That was the first time I thought he might be seeing something the project models weren't." He had told Franklin he would return to Harbor Ridge's office and pull older drainage calculations. Franklin said he was heading to Station 14 for one final comparison, then to Dana. Russell had asked why a 74-year-old man was going into the valley alone when rain was forecast. Franklin's answer had been typical Franklin. "Because I know where I'm going, and I'll be back before lunch." 3 hours later, Russell called. No answer. He called again before evening. Still nothing. Dana's voice stayed level. "And you didn't report that?" Russell looked down. "No." "Why?" The silence returned. But this one did not feel mysterious anymore. It felt ashamed. "Because I thought he was doing it on purpose." Dana waited. "Franklin had spent months telling me we were underestimating the risk. I thought he wanted me worried. I thought he'd shut off his phone, come back with another set of numbers, and enjoy watching me admit I'd been wrong. So when the man who told you he'd be back in a few hours didn't come back, you decided that was part of an argument?" Russell's jaw tightened. "Yes." Nolan looked away from the glass. There it was. Not violence, not conspiracy, not a hidden plan. Something smaller and more familiar. A person became so accustomed to hearing a warning that he stopped hearing the moment when the warning changed. Nolan knew another version of that mistake. Once he had said something was wrong, accepted another man's confidence, and failed to say it again. Russell had been on the opposite side of the same failure. Franklin had kept speaking. Russell had stopped listening. The information changed the search immediately. Dana no longer had only Franklin's notebook suggesting HW 413. She now had confirmation from the last known person to see him that Franklin had intended to reach Station 14 that same morning. Search crews were called before the storm could strengthen. Dana took command from a mobile unit set up near the Northern Service Road junction. Volunteer firefighters handled the lower routes and any crossings near rising water. Judith spread old hydrology maps across a folding table and marked the roads least likely to be cut off if Graywater rose. Rebecca stayed at the bridge command post, watching Pier 2 and the temporary water level sensors while remaining connected by radio. Nolan joined the Eastern Search Group with Rook. Piper stayed in the command vehicle with Marla Denton, a blanket, water, puppy food, and strict instructions that she was not joining anyone in the valley. Marla looked offended that the instruction was considered necessary. "I'm 69, not 9. Nolan glanced at Piper, who was trying to climb onto Marla's shoe. I was talking to her. Good. She listens about as well as Franklin. Before Nolan left, Piper followed Rook to the open vehicle door. Rook stepped down. Piper tried to follow. Marla caught the puppy gently beneath the chest and set her back on the floor. Piper whined once. Rook turned from several yards away. He looked at her, then at Nolan, then continued toward the search truck when Nolan moved. Piper stayed where she was. Nolan noticed that. Rook had not promised to remain beside her every second. Somehow Piper had already begun learning that someone could leave and still come back. The eastern route climbed above Station 14 through mixed pine and old maintenance cuts. Nolan worked Rook from one of Franklin's gloves, keeping the long line loose enough for the dog to make decisions. 2 firefighters traveled with them, while Dana coordinated parallel teams by radio. The first half-mile gave them little. Rain from the previous days had contaminated the road with vehicle tracks, wildlife, and runoff. Then Rook slowed near a weathered survey stake beside a narrow junction. He circled once, returned to the post, and held there. Nolan saw faint red carpenter pencil marks under the wet grime, Franklin's habit, though not proof by itself. A few yards farther on, Rook located a faded tan rain shell wedged beneath low brush. Dana's team photographed it before anyone moved it. Nolan recognized it from one of Franklin's photographs at the farm. It appeared he had shed or lost it while moving through the route before the weather worsened. More importantly, Rook had established that Franklin had been there. The scent continued down a lower track towards Station 14. Nolan followed until the land flattened near a drainage crossing. Water now spread across the road, shallow at the edges but moving hard enough in the center to carry branches and muddy debris. Rook approached the first wet gravel, stopped, and lifted his head. Nolan gave him time. The shepherd tried the edge once, smelled across the flowing water, then backed away. Nolan looked toward the opposite bank. Station 14 lay somewhere beyond the low ground. Every part of him wanted the route to continue there because Franklin's notebook said it should. Months earlier, maybe even days earlier, Nolan would have asked Rook for one more attempt simply because the map supported it. Instead, he saw what the dog was actually telling him. Whatever scent had existed through the low crossing had been broken by water, and the route itself was becoming less safe. "All right," Nolan said. "Not this way." One of the firefighters pointed toward a secondary maintenance line on the ridge. "Eastern spur still looks open." Nolan keyed his radio. "Dana, lower approach is compromised. Rook loses the trail at moving water. We're taking the eastern high route." Dana did not ask him to prove it. "Copy. Judith says stay above the marked drainage contour." That was all. Nolan turned with Rook, and the shepherd immediately followed. Nolan did not feel as though he had surrendered control. He felt as though he had finally used it correctly. The eastern spur climbed, but the scent did not return. Rook checked several bends and twice looked back at Nolan before moving on. Yet he never gave the clear working commitment Nolan had seen earlier. 30 minutes passed. Rain strengthened against the leaves. The firefighters spread out visually while staying within safe distance. Below them, Graywater Valley had begun to lose detail behind gray sheets of weather. The search was reaching the frustrating point, where every plausible route opened into 2 more. Dana's voice came over the radio. Another team had reached the lower Station 14 approach from the west, but could not safely continue. No Franklin. No response to calls. Nolan stopped beneath a stand of furs and gave Rook water. The dog drank, then stood beside him, ears moving with the sounds of rain, radios, distant engines, and the river below. Nolan looked toward the ridge. Franklin had been out here for days. If he had remained close to Station 14, why had no one heard or seen him? If he had moved, which direction made sense for a 74-year-old engineer who knew this terrain better than most of the people searching it? Nolan almost began constructing the answer himself. He stopped. "Judith," he called over the radio. "If Station 14 became inaccessible from below, where would Franklin go?" A pause. Paper moved near Judith's microphone. "Depends how old his map was." "Why?" "Because there used to be a secondary observation platform above it. Eastern Ridge, before the digital conversion." "Still there?" "I don't know." Nolan looked uphill. Another possibility. Not an answer. Back at the command vehicle, Piper had been asleep across Marla's boot when a firefighter tested a whistle over the radio channel. The teams had discussed using 3 short blasts because Nolan had explained Piper's reaction to Franklin's training signal. It was not being treated as a rescue beacon. Nobody knew whether Franklin even had the whistle. The test was only to make sure the calls could be distinguished from radio noise. 3 short notes came through the speaker. Piper shot upright so quickly that the blanket slid from beneath her. She barked once, a small, sharp sound Marla had barely heard from her before, then rushed toward the vehicle door. Rook's absence no longer mattered. The sound did. Marla stared at the puppy, then reached for the radio. "Dana, go ahead. Play that whistle again." Another 3 notes. Piper whined and pawed once at the closed door. Marla looked at the old field notes beside her. Franklin taught her that sound in less than a week. "We know." "Yes, but we're thinking about the wrong direction." Dana paused. "Explain." "We keep trying to call him. If Franklin has his own whistle, maybe we should stop making noise long enough to hear him." Dana did not dismiss the suggestion because it came from Marla or because it had begun with a 7-week-old puppy. Within minutes, she ordered a coordinated listening stop. Engines were shut off where safe. Radios went silent except for emergency traffic. Search teams stopped calling Franklin's name. On the eastern ridge, the sudden quiet felt unnatural. Rain struck Nolan's hood. Water hissed through pine needles. Rook stood beside him, still. 10 seconds passed. 20. Nolan heard only weather. At 30 seconds, he began to think the silence had given them nothing. Then, faint enough that he almost doubted it. 1 whistle. A pause. 2 more. 3 short notes. Rook's head snapped toward the slope above and east of them. Nolan heard one firefighter whisper, "There." The whistles came again, not below at Station 14, above them. Nolan keyed the radio. "Dana, we have it! Eastern Ridge!" Judith answered almost immediately. "That matches the old auxiliary platform. Continue uphill. Do not cut toward the drainage." This time, Rook was not following Franklin's scent. He did something simpler and just as important. He oriented to the sound with Nolan and moved with the team toward the high route. They climbed another quarter-mile before the trees opened around an old concrete observation hut, barely visible beneath vines and weathered timber. Nolan saw movement at the doorway. Franklin Voss was sitting beneath the narrow overhang with a field pack beside him and a brass whistle in one hand. He looked older than he had in Dana's photograph. His white hair was flattened from damp air, his dusty blue work shirt wrinkled beneath a faded canvas jacket, and exhaustion had pulled deeper lines into his face. But he was upright, conscious, and very much alive. Franklin looked at the firefighters first, then Nolan, then Rook. "Well," he said hoarsely. That took longer than I hoped. One firefighter laughed from pure relief. Nolan crouched several feet away while the medic assessed him. Franklin was tired and mildly dehydrated, but he had avoided serious injury. He had carried emergency water and food in his field pack and had stayed at the upper station once the lower road became impassable. His truck had been blocked farther back after a tree came down across the service route. Franklin had walked to Station 14, completed the reading, then found that runoff had cut the safest return path. Instead of attempting the flooded low road, he climbed to the old auxiliary station to wait. His phone had no usable signal. A small field radio he carried could receive fragments, but was too weak to transmit consistently through the valley. The whistle had been his simplest option once he heard search activity. Franklin did not ask where Piper was. Not yet. He reached immediately for the weatherproof instrument case beside his pack. Give this to Crane. Nolan took it. We already know Pier 2's a problem. Franklin fixed him with pale blue eyes. No. He shook his head once. You know half of it. Judith met them where the eastern route widened enough for the rescue vehicle. Franklin refused to explain until she had the instrument case open. Inside were Station 14 readings taken before the weather worsened, alongside handwritten comparisons from Holloway. Judith's face changed as she aligned the times. Dana listened over the radio. Rebecca received photographs and transmitted values from the bridge command post. Within 15 minutes, Rebecca was no longer discussing possibilities in the same language she had used the day before. The new data showed what Franklin had been trying to confirm. Once Holloway reached a certain flow level, North Cut was accepting only a fraction of the overflow assumed in the older watershed model. Water that had once been distributed east through the shallow channel was remaining in Graywater's main channel instead. The short-duration peaks Franklin had captured at G7 were not isolated sensor oddities. Station 14 confirmed the pattern upstream. Rebecca's voice came through the radio. I am not saying the bridge is going to fail. Nobody interrupted. I am saying the current readings have exceeded the conditions under which I am willing to keep normal traffic on it. That distinction carried more weight than any dramatic prediction could have. Rebecca formally recommended full closure. County officials approved it. Dana began implementation before Franklin had even reached the command vehicle. Graywater Bridge closed in both directions. The consequence arrived almost immediately. A senior center shuttle with 17 passengers was on the hospital side of the river after afternoon appointments. The southern detour had begun taking water across one low section, and emergency management would not route the bus through it. 2 days earlier, that situation might have become another emergency layered onto the first. Instead, the plan from the town meeting activated. Dr. Evelyn Hart confirmed medications for passengers who needed evening doses. The East Side Church opened its fellowship hall. Firefighters moved residents who needed assistance from the shuttle to the building. Families received calls before rumors reached them. Volunteers brought food, blankets, chargers, and clothing. An ambulance remained staged on the eastern side. Nobody attempted to cross the closed bridge. Nobody was told to simply wait in the bus until morning. Nolan stood near the command table watching messages move between people who 48 hours earlier had been arguing about whether preparation itself was an overreaction. No one person was rescuing Stonebridge Hollow. That was why it worked. By the next morning, rainfall had eased enough for Rebecca and a structural inspection team to evaluate Pier 2 from controlled access points. The bridge still stood exactly where people expected to see it. No collapsed roadway, no dramatic wreckage. But the inspection confirmed fresh scour around the foundation and movement beyond the level Rebecca considered acceptable for ordinary traffic loads. She found Nolan near the barricade afterward. "You wanted proof." He looked toward the empty bridge. "I wanted certainty." Rebecca shook her head. "Different product." He almost smiled. The bridge standing behind her was not evidence that the warnings had been exaggerated. It was evidence that people had acted before a failure became their proof. Franklin returned to the main command post shortly after the inspection. Marla had kept Piper inside the vehicle until the search area was fully clear. When Franklin stepped into the lot, he took the brass whistle from his pocket. 3 short notes. Piper stood. For one moment she seemed uncertain, staring through the open vehicle door at a man she had known for only 6 days and waited for through 4 much longer ones. Franklin crouched. "Piper." The puppy launched forward. Halfway there, she stopped for one heartbeat, ears uneven, body leaning ahead, as though memory had to catch up with movement. Then Franklin said her name again. Piper ran the rest of the distance and pressed herself against his chest. Franklin put both arms around her. He closed his eyes. No one spoke. Rook stood beside Nolan, calm and watchful. After a while, Franklin looked up and noticed him. "You found her?" Nolan looked down at Rook. "Rook found her." Franklin's tired smile appeared. "Is there a difference?" Nolan remembered the kitchen door Rook had refused to let him close. The trail through the woods. The moments the shepherd had gone ahead, stopped, and looked back. The lower route Rook had refused to take when Nolan had been sure the river was the obvious direction. "Yes," Nolan said. Franklin waited. Nolan rested one hand against the thick fur at Rook's shoulder, but he did not explain. Not yet. Around them, Stonebridge Hollow was beginning the inconvenient work of living without its most important bridge. The missing man had been found. The immediate danger had been contained. The measurements Franklin had risked days in the valley to collect had finally been heard. Yet the question left behind was larger than any one person. Russell had not intended for Franklin to disappear. The county had not intended to bury Franklin's old warning. The hospital had not intended to keep an unsafe bridge open. The quarry had operated under approved permits. Engineers had used accepted models. People had done their jobs, often for reasonable reasons. And still, Stonebridge Hollow had come close enough to the edge that a 7-week-old puppy, an old whistle, a retired engineer, and a German shepherd who knew when not to keep moving, had helped force an entire town to look again. Nolan looked at Graywater Bridge beyond the barricades. Finding Franklin had answered where the old man had gone. The harder question remained: how had so many responsible people managed to stop looking at the same problem at the same time? Graywater Bridge stayed closed after the storm, but Stonebridge Hollow did not stop moving. Within 48 hours, temporary barriers became controlled work zones. Engineers placed additional monitors around Pier 2. Fire crews kept equipment staged on both sides of the river. The East Side Church continued serving meals to people whose routines had been broken by the closure, though by the 3rd day, the fellowship hall looked less like an emergency shelter and more like an inconvenient neighborhood reunion. Franklin Voss returned to his farm with instructions to rest, drink more water than he thought necessary, and stop treating 74 as an argument against common sense. He ignored the spirit of the last instruction while following the first 2. Piper went home with him. Rook returned with Nolan. Graywater River fell gradually, leaving brown marks along the banks that showed where the water had reached. The bridge remained standing. That mattered. it also complicated the story people wanted to tell afterward. A disaster would have given Stonebridge Hollow a clean before and after. Instead, the town had to accept something less dramatic and more difficult. Acting in time had prevented the proof some people still believed they needed. The official review began the following week. Nolan expected it to produce a name. Even after everything that had happened, some part of him still believed systems became understandable once responsibility could be pinned to a person. The review refused to cooperate. Franklin's 6-year-old report had been filed under the wrong category. Nobody had ordered that. Northcutt had narrowed over time through legal projects approved separately. The quarry expansion increased runoff, but its drainage plan had passed the standards applied when it was built. New neighborhoods replaced absorbent ground with roofs, pavement, driveways, and storm drains. The county had postponed a full watershed model update more than once because other capital projects competed for funding. Harbor Ridge had interpreted the available bridge data less conservatively than Franklin. Hospital officials had previously asked that at least one lane remain available whenever engineering conditions permitted, because the alternative route added medical risk. Russell Keene had become so accustomed to Franklin describing worst reasonable cases that he had failed to recognize when Franklin's concern had changed from persistent disagreement to immediate urgency. Franklin himself had driven into the valley alone because he believed a few more measurements would settle an argument that had already consumed months. Each item looked manageable when separated from the others. Together, they had changed a river. At the county hearing, the room was quieter than the town hall meeting had been. No one shouted from the back. The immediate crisis had passed, and people now had the uncomfortable luxury of listening. Russell sat at one end of the long table without his Harbor Ridge jacket. The company had removed him from the Graywater project pending the independent review. Nolan could not tell whether Russell looked older or simply less defended. When asked why he had rejected Franklin's emergency requests, Russell did not repeat the arguments about probability and disruption, as if they still settled the matter. "I thought I was preventing an overreaction," he said. One reviewer asked, "Do you believe that now?" Russell looked toward Franklin. "I believe I had reasons. I don't believe having reasons made the decision correct." Franklin sat 2 chairs away wearing his dusty blue work shirt, red carpenter pencil tucked into the breast pocket, as usual. He had recovered most of his strength, though Dana had made him promise not to turn the hearing into a lecture unless someone specifically asked him a question. He lasted 23 minutes. "The hard thing about risk," Franklin said, "is that bad decisions rarely feel bad while you're making them. If they did, we'd make fewer." Russell met his eyes. Franklin continued, "You thought I was too conservative." "You were." A few people in the room laughed. Franklin nodded. "Sometimes. And sometimes I wasn't conservative enough." Also true. There was no reconciliation staged for the room. Russell did not become Franklin's friend. Franklin did not absolve him. The review kept going because the point was no longer which man had won an argument. The point was why the system required 2 men to keep arguing without ever forcing the larger question to be answered. Rebecca Sloan's technical findings changed the county's repair plan. Graywater Bridge received emergency reinforcement around Pier 2 before crews began a larger rehabilitation design. Northcutt could not simply be restored to its 40-year-old footprint. Houses, roads, farms, and utilities now occupied land the old overflow had once crossed. Instead, engineers reopened portions where capacity could safely be recovered and redesigned several constrictions. Holloway Weir received updated control equipment. Northridge Aggregate agreed, under revised county requirements, to modify parts of its stormwater system and provide more frequent high-flow data. None of those changes solved the problem alone. That was exactly why the county created something Franklin had been asking for in different forms for years. One interdisciplinary review group, where bridge engineering, hydrology, hospital operations, fire response, transportation, emergency planning, and resident representatives saw the same data at the same time. Judith called it a meeting with too many chairs. Dana called it progress. Franklin called it 6 years late. Rebecca said, "All three statements can be true." Nolan mostly listened. That surprised him. He had spent enough years believing responsibility meant entering a room prepared to take control. The new review meetings worked differently. Rebecca understood what the bridge could tolerate. Judith understood how water reached it. Evelyn understood what closure meant for patients. Fire crews understood what detours did to response time. Farmers understood roads that looked fine on planning maps, but failed under harvest traffic. Nolan knew enough about planning and failure to see the value of putting them together, but he did not need to become an expert in each part. The first few meetings still exhausted him more than a day in the workshop. Too many opinions, too many qualifiers, too many sentences beginning with "it depends." But the decisions improved because of it. By early September, Franklin was back at his farm full-time, though Nolan had quietly made sure that full-time did not mean alone. He and Rook started stopping by 2 or 3 afternoons each week. Sometimes Nolan repaired a pump or tightened something Franklin had been pretending was not loose. Sometimes he did nothing except sit on the porch while Franklin complained about the county's new forms. Piper remained entirely Franklin's dog. There was never any question about it. The puppy had changed in the few weeks since Nolan first found her under the abandoned utility truck. Her folded ear had begun standing more often, though it still surrendered whenever she was tired. Her legs seemed to grow before the rest of her body could agree on proportions. She followed Franklin through the yard with fierce devotion until a leaf moved, a grasshopper jumped, or Rook did something more interesting. Franklin had been correct about one thing. Raising a young German shepherd at 74 required more help than pride liked admitting. "I can manage a puppy," he told Nolan one afternoon. Piper immediately ran between his ankles carrying one of his gloves. Franklin grabbed the porch rail to keep his balance. Nolan looked at him. Franklin sighed. "I can manage most of a puppy." Rook became the part Franklin could not teach from a book. At the edge of the farm road, Rook stopped automatically before the pavement. Piper once tried to continue, realized the older dog was no longer beside her, and backed up. The next week, she stopped only after Rook did. A month later, she stopped almost at the same time. When Nolan walked toward the far fence, Rook moved ahead 20 yards, paused, and looked back. Piper watched. At first, she used Rook's pause as an opportunity to jump on him. Then she began turning too. The behavior was messy and inconsistent. Sometimes Piper checked back beautifully and then immediately chased a leaf into the wrong direction. Sometimes Franklin gave the 3-whistle recall, and she ran halfway toward him before discovering something more interesting in the grass. She still tried to steal Rook's food. Rook responded by simply standing between her and his bowl until she gave up. Nothing about Piper suggested a miraculous puppy. She was learning because she lived beside an older dog who made certain habits look ordinary. One afternoon, Nolan sat with Franklin on the porch while Rook rested in the grass below the steps. Piper was trying to carry Franklin's faded work glove and a stick at the same time, unwilling to accept that her mouth had limits. Nolan's phone was in his hand. He had not taken it out to make a call. He had told himself that. Franklin noticed the screen anyway. Mason Reed. Franklin looked once, then returned to his coffee. Nolan waited. Franklin did not ask. That somehow made Nolan speak. "I owe somebody a call." Franklin took another drink. "Then call." "It's been 3 years. Phones still work after 3 years." Nolan looked at him. "That your professional assessment? Retired engineer, broad skill set." Nolan smiled despite himself. The contact remained open. For 3 years, Nolan had treated calling Mason as if there had to be a correct version of it, the correct explanation, the correct apology, the correct moment when enough time had passed for both men to know what the conversation was supposed to accomplish. It was the same habit in a different uniform. Know the route before moving. Control the outcome before starting. Across the yard, Rook rose and walked toward the fence. Piper followed, still dragging the glove. Rook went farther than usual, stopped, and looked back. Piper continued several steps. Then she noticed. She stopped, turned. For a moment, she simply stood there looking at the older shepherd. Then she went back. Nolan pressed the call button. The phone rang long enough that he almost believed Mason would not answer. Then the line opened. Nolan said nothing for 1 second too long. "Hey, Mason." Silence. Nolan looked down at the porch boards. "Yeah, I know." Franklin did not move. The voice on the other end was too faint for Nolan to make out from where Franklin sat, and Nolan was grateful for that. "No," Nolan said after a while. "I'm not calling to explain." Another long silence. Piper dropped Franklin's glove and finally succeeded in carrying the stick. Nolan watched her follow Rook. "I just think I should stop waiting for a better reason." He listened. His face changed only slightly. Franklin looked away toward the fields. The call lasted longer than Nolan expected, and much less time than 3 years deserved. There was no sudden forgiveness. Mason did not tell Nolan everything was fine. Nolan did not ask him to. When the conversation ended, Nolan remained seated with the phone resting against his knee. Franklin gave him nearly a minute. "Well?" "He didn't hang up." Franklin nodded. "Good start." That was all. By October, the cottonwoods along Graywater had started turning yellow. Temporary reinforcement allowed limited local traffic across the bridge under strict controls, while the larger rehabilitation continued. Heavy trucks still followed alternate routes. The church returned to being mostly a church. Hospital crews revised their emergency staging procedures permanently instead of putting them back in a binder until the next problem. Stonebridge Hollow did not become a town where everyone suddenly agreed. It became something more believable. A town where several people now knew whom to call before an argument became an emergency. Dana came to Nolan's workshop on a Tuesday afternoon while he was rebuilding a generator carburetor. Rook slept near the open bay door. Piper was visiting with Franklin and had spent the previous 10 minutes carrying the same pine cone from one side of the yard to the other, as if transporting critical equipment. Dana set her dented stainless steel thermos on Nolan's workbench. "That better not leak." "It survived 16 years in a patrol vehicle. Your workbench isn't the threat." "What do you need?" "The county is making the emergency planning group permanent." "No." Dana stared at him. Nolan continued working. "I haven't told you when the meetings are." "Doesn't matter. You also don't know how often." "Still no." Dana looked toward Rook. "Is he always this cooperative?" Rook opened one eye. Don't recruit my dog." Outside, Piper suddenly sprinted after a dry leaf blown across the yard. Franklin called once from near the truck, but the puppy was too busy. She ran past Rook, reached the edge of the open space, and kept going another 10 yards. Then she stopped. No whistle, no command. She turned around. Rook was walking behind her at his usual measured pace. Piper waited. When Rook reached her, she fell in beside him. Nolan watched them longer than he needed to. He remembered the first night in August, Rook moving through wet woods, going ahead, stopping, looking back, making sure Nolan was still there. Nolan put the screwdriver down. Dana waited. "What day?" Her expression did not change, but satisfaction entered her voice anyway. "Second Thursday. Evening?" 6. Nolan picked up the screwdriver again. "I'm not chairing anything. I would never do that to the county." A few weeks later, on a cool early autumn morning, Nolan and Franklin walked the high road overlooking Graywater Valley. Bridge crews worked in the distance, machinery small against the river. Some stretches of North Cut were visible again, where brush had been cleared, and temporary earthwork reopened room for high water. It did not look like restoration in the romantic sense. There were excavators, survey stakes, orange barriers, and people arguing over measurements. It looked like work. Rook and Piper moved ahead. Rook was slower than he had been in summer, not because age had suddenly found him, but because Piper made every walk inefficient. She investigated tire marks, chased seed heads, returned, ran ahead again, then doubled back for reasons known only to herself. Franklin watched her. "I'm starting to think your dog is teaching mine bad habits." Nolan looked at Rook. "Which one?" "Patience." "That sounds useful." "Not at my age." Piper accelerated along the road. 10 yards, then 15. Rook continued at the same pace. Piper went a few steps farther, stopped, turned. She looked back at Rook, then at Franklin, then toward Nolan, and waited. No one called her. No one needed to. Nolan remembered believing responsibility meant knowing the route before anyone else did. Go first. Check everything. Carry the decision because letting somebody else carry it meant accepting the possibility they might be wrong. Graywater had taught him something messier. Franklin had seen one part. Judith another, Rebecca another, Dana another. Russell had been wrong without being evil. The county had failed without anyone deciding to fail it. A puppy had waited under a truck because an old man believed he would return in a few hours. And Rook had walked into the woods without ever knowing where the whole story would end. He had only known when to move and when to stop. Rook reached Piper. The younger shepherd immediately started forward again. This time she stayed closer. Nolan and Franklin continued behind them as the road curved above Graywater River. For years, Nolan had thought responsibility meant being the one who knew the way. Rook had never required that of him. The dog had taught him something simpler. Move when it is time to move, but never go so far that you forget to look back for whoever is still trying to follow. Sometimes responsibility is not about being the strongest person in the room or having every answer before anyone else. Sometimes it is simply knowing when to stop, look back, and listen. Rook understood that long before Nolan did. He could move ahead without leaving the people behind him. And in the end, Stonebridge Hollow was saved not by one hero, but by people who finally shared what they knew, trusted the right hands, and acted before caution became regret. In our own lives, we may never face a failing bridge or a rising river, but we all have people, warnings, and relationships worth checking back on before too much distance grows between us. If this story stayed with you, share what it meant to you in the comments, and subscribe if you would like to hear more stories about loyalty, courage, and second chances. And if you have any feelings, thoughts, or suggestions about this story, would you share them in the comments below so we can listen, learn, and keep making these stories better?